Okay, so this week I am speaking with Kashmira Nakhoda. Did I pronounce that right as well?
Perfect. Yeah.
Before we started, I apologize. That's Dr. Kashmira Nakhoda. I should re-say that. Um, Kashmira studied in France for her, I believe it looks like undergraduate as well as master's. You then went to the University of Arizona and studied under Jim Burge and worked with, or were supervised by Matt Dubin, two people that I know quite well. Um, you then had an internship in Toulouse. You got your PhD in aerospace engineering at the Politecnico di Milano in Milan, um, and then had a stint at Safran Riosque in France, and then a postdoc position at Brookhaven. And now you run RayKi, which is your consulting company. And that's a lot. So how did you get into optics? And as much as you want to share, but what was that process like? From starting optics through having your consulting.
First, it's mostly being interested in astronomy, astrophysics as a child, right? I remember my dad had that subscription for French science magazines. So I would take all of them and cut up pictures of planets and galaxies, without obviously at that time understanding a lot about it, but I was still fascinated about that world. And to the point, actually, that my parents took me on a special trip to Florida when I was from France to Florida to see the launch of, at Cap Canaveral to see the launch of a rocket. So obviously, that was an amazing experience, and that whole and I was like 5 or 6 years old, so it's not like even.
But
But
I feel like at that age, seeing a rocket launch, I mean, at any age, seeing a rocket launch has to be impressive. But at that age, it has to be like,
wow,
yeah, the craziest thing. So, anyways, sorry for interrupting.
it was no, that was definitely a very crucial part, I think, of the whole process. But by the time I reached high school, I still didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I was interested in space applications, but in practical terms, how I could work in it was still a little blurry, I would say. I knew I didn't want to be like an astrophysicist or an astronomer. I wanted to have more of a hands-on experience. So that was like up to high school, and then I entered that very weird French system that's called the classe prépa, where it's really like a 2 years of intensive program. I mean, in my case, in science, so mathematics, physics, and engineering sciences. And for these 2 years, you really prepare for entering the top schools in France. And so the way it works is like at the end of 2 years, you have like a national exam, and you pass that exam for a whole bank of schools. So you don't really know. I mean, there are some that you are more famous than others, but usually it's like hundreds and hundreds of school you pass the exam for. And so at that point, I'm within like among like 15 or more schools that I was accepted to. I had like flyers, like a whole bunch of flyers that I had to choose which school I wanted to go to. One of them was Institut Optique. And that was really, even though, we've been introduced to optics before through classes, this is the only time when I realized, oh, wait a second, that's actually exactly what I want to do, right? I want to build systems to look at the sky, right? In my mind, that was really that process only at that moment, right?
You wanted to
Um,
do it.
I knew, and it felt like it felt natural. I was like, oh yeah, that's exactly what I would like to do. Uh, Plus, that school had that partnership with Arizona where we could potentially come and do a dual degree program, so a dual master's. And obviously, for me, like coming to Arizona, go and mostly actually James Birch group, right? Like the large optics group, building those big telescopes and making actually those pictures, right? That I was getting up in those magazines. That was really interesting for me. So I did 2 years in France and then I came to Arizona. Um,
I mean, to interrupt you briefly. Can I ask what region of France?
oh yeah, I was born about 30 minutes south of Paris. And I stayed in that area the
Okay.
whole time. Yeah.
So quite a big, not only a big cultural shift, but also climactic and environment, right? The
Right.
Synchrotron Desert's very, very different from
Paris area.
any area I think of France, but certainly the Paris region. So
Definitely. Yeah. But to be honest, like transferring to a university setting is not as difficult to some extent because a lot of people are international to start with. And obviously you have to adapt to a different climate and new people, a new mindset. But it was a fun experience, right? Like I think I remember it as a fun experience. I guess the only part that was maybe a little more challenging is like um, the work system was very different, right? Like the way you approach a project or the way you communicate also was very different. So on that part, we had to adapt a little more, but um, I think at least the University of Arizona made it very smooth for international students to come and feel at ease. More than Italy, actually, and we'll get into this later. But yeah, it was a fantastic experience. So I think the second day I arrived, the schools, I mean that the semester started in Arizona. I had in mind like I have to go meet actually Jim Birch because I need a project in this group, right? And so I knocked on his door and he was I mean very sweet and he asked me what was my experience and what I could basically do, right? And that's when I got really lucky in a certain way because right before coming to Arizona, I was doing that internship for 2 months in the south of France. Now it's Airbus Defense and Space Company, but at that time it was called EATS. I mean, it's just a change of name, but basically they're working on like satellites and other space related thing. And during that 2 months internship, they wanted me to characterize BRDF of silicon pore optics. And I had only the time really during these 2 months to understand the concept. I mean, to get familiar with the concepts, but obviously 2 months is a very short time to get anything fruitful done. But Jim was like, "Oh, that's amazing because we actually have a project, a new project where we have to characterize the BRDF of this giant telescope." Like,
yeah.
that's amazing. And so the BRDF is not a concept I think that probably everybody has
Yeah,
heard of.
why don't you say, I mean, A, what it stands for and just generally kind of what's involved there?
Yeah, so basically what they wanted to know is how the mirror scatters, right? Like how once the light hits your mirror, in a perfect case scenario, the light reflects in the same angle as the incidence angle. So incidence angle, and then it reflects in that same specular angle. But obviously, if your mirror is not perfect, the surface will make the light scatter in all directions, right? In different planes and different directions. And so that's the function we use to characterize this, and is called the bidirectional reflection function. So the BRDF distribution function, sorry.
That's why I asked you to say it, because I always forget what the acronym stands for.
So that was like that was really, I was really lucky, right? Like I've had like I mean, the chances that would happen were, almost so that's how I started working on ATS. I mean, at that time, ATST, now DKIST. And my goal was to characterize how we would measure the BRDF of DKIST.
And did you do this on the final piece, or the quote unquote demo piece that they had?
So when I was there, they were still working on the initial demo piece that was supposed to be the final piece, but didn't end up being the final piece. So I was still there when the crack happened. But when my work, actually, I've never touched the action mirror, but I had to define the protocol to measure the BRDF on that mirror, if that makes sense. And I don't know if were you planning on, you want to talk about these details a little later, or?
Well, I was curious because you and I evidently just missed one another in Jim's group. So I joined Jim's group at the state when Tian Chuan started to do infrared deflectometry on the DKIST mirror, and Rin did spots, and Rin did Scots, Alex did spots. So once they'd started actually grinding and polishing and doing the measurements on the not cracked piece. So I was curious for my own sake of like, I just missed you in Jim's group, but anyways, yeah.
So you arrived, you already had the final piece, right? By the time you were there, the final piece was.
Yeah, but for some reason, I have this vivid memory of going down. I guess it was a tour or something, of going down and seeing the piece with, the segment missing.
Okay.
And it must have just been a tour for a class or something. So.
Because when I was there, I think the grinding and polishing was ongoing, and then at some point I discovered there was like a crack.
Yeah.
And but that was like towards the end of my master's there. Yeah. So I left with a crack in the mirror, but I never got. That was like one of the things I wouldn't say I regret, but obviously I wish I could have I've seen the mirror every time, right? Like it was right there in the basement, but I've never touched it per se.
I'll just offer that it got exponentially more stressful being in the vicinity of the mirror, the better it was polished. Like the smoother it got and the more reflective the smoother it got, the more stressed you'd be anytime that you entered the room. And do I really have anything? Do I have a ring on? And anything like that was like, oh man, I'm really worried about it. So and it was funny. It stood out to me when they picked it up. The mirror's done. We have the celebratory party, and okay, we're gonna pick it up and they're gonna bring the crane in. And I have this vivid memory of everyone kind of being like, well, we're leaving. We're gonna not be in the building. Like I don't want to see it. I don't want to be around it. Let me know, next week when it's done. So yeah, anyways.
There was
But
so much work involved around it also that I
yeah, and
can
the and
imagine.
we might talk about this, but the level of precision, certainly for the DKIST, it was called so-called super polished or super precision,
Right.
I think.
Super
Um,
polished now.
so I think across 4.2 meters, it got down to like roughly 20 nanometer RMS. And you can speak certainly more than I can about the scattering profile, but it's like a crazy mirror, and so a crazy mirror to a level that's hard to comprehend. And so just being around it was like nobody breathed on it, you know. But
No, so I think
I interrupted you. So you characterized how we would measure the BRDF, and I think that you did so in a very humble way. This is a really really complicated process, and hard to get right. So you came up with kind of the method of how we were going to measure it.
but okay, we have a scatter requirement, right? We know we don't want like basically I won't go in the details of what exactly the BRDF specification was, but basically what it was saying is like in that one angle direction, we don't want more than a certain amount of scattered light. I think one inverse steradians, but doesn't matter. Like basically they were saying that we want the mirror to be so well polished. And we can understand why, right? Like when you look at the application of DK, DKIST or DKIST, you're looking at like the solar the corona of the sun, and you have a very bright source right next to it, which is the sun, and obviously you don't want anything that would come and bother what you're looking at that, like I think 1 milliradians, 1.6 arc minute, I think from the surface of the sun. So in this configuration, you can understand like you don't want any light from everything can scatter light, so you don't want the mirror to scatter any light. And I think it was proven. It was like there were some calculation done that showed that the surface roughness and the dust contamination would be like the main contribution to scatter light for that mirror. But then the question was like, you have a 4.2 mirror, and how do you measure that, right? Like, how do you know where the light is going? How do you like, what do you set up, like a giant scatterometer? Or the other problem, like if imagine you were to do that, you would have to have a very high reflective surface, but we're still in the polishing process. So what does it mean? Does it mean you have to coat part of the mirror and then measure those areas? But as you said before, you don't want to get anywhere close to the mirror or touch it for unnecessary reasons. But like you mentioned before, it was a super polished mirror. So a very smooth surface. And in this configuration, and luckily we had that, in this configuration, instead of measuring the scatter, you can actually just measure the surface. And just measuring the surface would give you, you can go back to what the BRDF would be in theory. And that theory is well established. It's nothing like I haven't invented anything on that end. But then the question was, is the instrument we have is going to give us an accurate measurement of the scatter? And so that's where my work was, like to make sure the MFT is going to be a viable solution to measure the BRDF of DKIST. So that was a long process. I mean, yeah, it was challenging process because you realize that a lot of the samples are actually not meeting all the requirements of the theory. So a lot of the samples I've been working on were just not working properly or meeting those requirements. There is a whole list of requirements that you need to meet for the theory to work. And when you read a book, really, it's like, okay, yeah, okay, these are the assumptions, and that's what we're working. But in the real world, you have to make sure those assumptions, they're not like assumptions that are put there just for show, right?
Right.
And then that's when you realize that most of those assumptions really have to be met in real life.
Yeah.
And that was like one of the big challenges of that project. But the day we actually had a scatter measurement meet the surface measurement prediction, like the prediction from the surface measurement, it was okay. This is the end of it. Finally, we're there, and that was a really really cool project, to be honest with you. I think maybe one of the best projects I've worked on. But yeah, so that was my introduction to metrology, basically.
Okay, right, and there's a lot involved in that, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit more, but I don't want to miss out on two of the other papers, so we can move ahead, and so you went from there. I'm going to absolutely butcher the order, but you did a PhD in law on aerospace.
Correct. So my PhD was in aerospace engineering department at Polytechnico, but really my work was just a continuation of the surface scattering prediction for I wanted to use the surface measurements to predict PSF, basically. But like I was telling you before, in Arizona, it was in a very specific smooth surface regime. So we're like in one given regime. But then the question was, what happens if you get out of the regime? How do you predict what the PSF would look like given a certain surface profile? So I was really extending and generalizing the numerical calculation behind surface contribution to PSF degradation. That makes sense.
Okay. It does make sense, and I think we'll get into it more, but why don't you expand upon that? I guess what was actually before even that, why don't you explain what the PSF is, and just how that would relate to the surface at a very high level, right? And then specifically the degradation of that surface. So why do we even care what the PSF is? And what does it stand for, I suppose?
So usually, let's say you want to image a star, right? And what you're expecting is to find. So the star, let's say we're considering a star as being a point source. And you would expect to image a point source, right? Or point. And obviously, in reality, there's a lot of other aspects that come into account. So in the best case scenario, you would have a diffraction limited PSF. So that's really what we call the PSF, right? Like what would be the image of a point when it goes through your optical system.
Mm-hmm. And a key thing there, I think, is what would be the image of an ideal point? Exactly. You said a star for a telescope. I think for people who, you asked me before we started, who typically listens to this? Well, it's people in optics, but there's optics covers so much. So I think a lot of people, haven't necessarily had to do metrology or had to do, how do I set up a point source, an ideal point source? Because just getting like an LED or a laser pointer, for example, or something silly like that, it's not a very good point. But a star acts like a really ideal, infinitely small kind of point object. And we have other ways to make that. So we input that into our system. It's a point input, and then we get the collected image, right? What does it look like for a perfect system that we always design but never actually build?
So usually you would like the image of a point would like ideally you want to image a point would be a point, right? That's what you would look for. That's what you would imagine. The reality behind it. And in optics, you also, when you start studying optics, you would refine that as having a diffraction limited point, right? In your system, that would be the ideal case scenario. But in reality, there are so many aspects in through the optical path that can come and bother your light. Like you can have aberrations. Some of the optical components are not perfect, or some light is coming from other parts of their system, or there are some of the light rays that are bouncing off the mounts. Anything, a dust in the middle, anything will come and bother the optical path, right? And so that point ends up being completely spread out. I mean, completely spread out to some extent, but what happens is that instead of having a point being a point, you get a point that's spreading out. And I think a good image, again, not coming from me, but a good image of it is when you try to write with a pen, right? And the ink, you would, when you write a letter, you would want the ink to do exactly what you did, but the reality is that the ink spreads out a little bit on the paper, and then it makes the whole writing a little more blurry. Right?
I like that analogy a lot.
I think it's a very good way to understand it, and so there are a lot of parameters that would explain what ink you use or what the paper material is, and how you write, how small you write, so that does it matter or not? And so all these aspects can translate to optics too. And so the whole point is I want my system to be as perfect as possible and to image as best as possible. And I want my point to be a point, which means that if I have 2 points, they will be imaged as 2 points and I can distinguish the two of them, right? And so a lot of parameters, characteristics of the optics would come into account by defining what the PSF would look like. And so in my case, for the PhD part, the idea was to remain focused on the optical surfaces and see how those matter, how an imperfect mirror, in my case, or an imperfect surface would change the PSF in the focal point, right?
And to theoretically predict that.
Exactly.
Okay.
But the challenge again here is that usually we have to distinguish the treatment of the surface based on what spatial frequency you're dealing with. So if you're dealing with high spatial frequencies, you can use the smooth surface regime, right? If you're dealing with mid-spatial frequencies, if you're dealing with low spatial frequencies, you can use ray tracing errors. And then you have a fuzzy limitations in between with the mid-spatial frequencies where you're never really sure how you should treat those data.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a bit of an issue because, first of all, the definition of the spatial frequencies will change depending on your application. What is the incidence angle you're looking at? What is the wavelength that's coming up, right? So this definition changes based on your setup, and there is no like really hard definition. It's right. So if you can build a system or a computation tool that can take all of these and treat all of these information, all this surface information the same way, instead of separating between ray tracing or high surface areas, then you eliminate one part of the problem, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, am I treating this information correctly or not? And so that was a big part of my PhD, and there were real applications for that. So in this case, some applications are like, some of the mirrors actually degrade over time because I was working with are Cherenkov telescopes, and they're in the open air. They're not protected, and they deteriorate over time. It doesn't matter much, maybe initially, but if they deteriorate enough, being in the desert, usually they're on islands, so you have also salt in the air, you have sand, you have a lot of things that can come and deteriorate your mirror. You want to know about it, right? You want to know what would be the best way to fabricate them, but also at which rate you want to change the mirrors, or what to expect, how to correct it if it's possible to correct it, or so all this information you need to know. You need to be able to evaluate and simulate ahead of time to know how to respond to it. So very interesting. It was a big part of my PhD work. But during that time, that's also when I got introduced to X-ray optics for space applications still. And that was also like a whole different world again that opens up in front of you, right? Like you feel like you know everything about visible optics and how to treat it. And then you go in X-rays and you use more or less the same terms, except maybe you won't use wavelengths, but you use energy, energies, etc. But the whole way you picture the optical system is completely different, right? Like everything is done mostly at grazing incidence angle. So you start looking at the planes you look at are very different from like the 2D image you would get in invisible optics. I feel like you have to rethink the whole setup again.
Yeah, I'm not even. I mean, I'm not familiar with designing or using X-ray optics, but I've been involved in the metrology of them. And I think one thing just to mention for the listeners is, we mentioned the DKIST mirror, or a lot of these large cutting edge telescope mirrors, their RMS precision over a large aperture is going to be, DKIST was cutting edge at 20 nanometers RMS. X-ray optics, they're sub-nanometer RMS. And they tend to be these rectangular,
longer.
Right. Like you said, because it's at this glancing angle. But beyond that, I mean, I'm totally ignorant about their design and operation. So yeah, please continue.
That's when I really was introduced in the metrology part initially of these X-ray telescopes, and after that, I mean, minus my stay at Safran Rios when I was again working on the ELT telescope. So like again, very large telescope, the metrology of this very large telescope. I came fortunately or unfortunately to the US because I got married in the meantime. And that's how I ended up here in the East Coast. And so that's when I joined the Brookhaven National Lab.
Mm.
where I was working in optical metrology, but again, this time for X-ray optics applied to synchrotrons instead of space applications. So that's how I made my way through the whole space optics to synchrotron and X-rays. And at that time, at the end of those 4 years of postdocs, I just felt like there is such a, I mean, and I realized that before too, but there's such a big world in optics, right? Optical industry that you know better than anyone, but can touch telecommunications, healthcare, biology, like entertainment, like screens. It's so wide. And like I was telling you, when I entered optics, I entered in the prospect of working for space applications, but then I had that whole panel of industries that are based on optics and all these properties and theories we've learned that can still be applied. And I just realized I want to learn about all these things, right? I don't want to be, somehow I didn't want to be stuck in one single field. And so it felt like almost a natural transition to go to consulting business and open RayKi. And because yeah, I felt like I want to learn about everything that's available there, but yet applying my knowledge to serve all these different fields. And the other part, I don't know, maybe for graduate students, it could be the other part is I realized at some point that even though I love science and I love research and I love all the technical aspect, that's not all I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to open myself to more of a business related applications and really like using my knowledge and my knowledge in theory, but also my knowledge in the market available in optics, whether in the US or in Europe or internationally, and use that towards serving, different applications and different fields of optics, or different fields that use optics and optical metrology, most importantly, for us.
I think one of the things I read, I'm not sure if it was on your website or it's for sure on the PowerPoint, but you know, I think it would have been hard for me to appreciate this when I was younger. Certainly in grad school, but even a few years ago. But you list that you facilitate connections, and I really like that because it's really important. Like you said, there's such a broad array of optics and what that means, and even in this special niche of metrology, there's a broad array of X-ray optics metrology and large optics metrology or small optics metrology and blah 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 blah. There's so many different things, and knowing the right person for the job can be the difference between, well, yeah, it was made right, or it wasn't. And if it's a big important project, you want to make sure it's made right. You want to minimize the time it takes to make that right. And I think particularly in optics and probably other fields that similarly feel kind of small, knowing the right people is really important. So I wanted to mention that because I really liked that that little tagline at the end. And I know I don't mean to say that that's the primary part of RayKi, but that's an interesting part. So I also wanted to mention that again, I similarly wouldn't have felt this way in graduate school, but I do now. But there's a really rich reward to the business side of it, right? Like you're saying, into the market side. Um, and yeah, I think it's sufficient to say there's a rich reward. I've talked to Jim about this before. I don't know if you ever talked to him when you were in school about it, but he has, I think, strong opinions about academia, and I hope to interview him at some point. But I think that he phrased it one time of like, well, I really like to do stuff and solve problems, and you can do a lot. You can certainly do that in academia, but I think that you can do it quicker in industry or in business just by necessity, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes, like you said, that I personally, if I loved academia, and I've touched both, right? I've touched a bit of industry and academia. And I love the fact that you're really at the state of the art in academia. That's like you're given the freedom to do almost whatever you want. I mean, to a certain extent, there is still funding issue, but you get a lot of freedom. However, you get things done in industry really fast. But I would say that's maybe why I really liked the Loft group, I think, because I felt it was the right compromise between being in a research position, but you were working on contracts still. So you didn't have you still needed to provide results and present. I mean, at least in my case, I'm sure it was the same for you. In my case, the client was NSO, and we had to tell them that this mirror is going to be made and it's going to be good, and they will get their science done the way they want, right? And you had to prove that to them. It's not only, I mean, there is obviously the whole research aspect that's interesting and frustrating sometimes at the same time, but the end result is still like, I have that end goal that I have to prove something, right, to an actual client. And I don't think you get that in all aspects of academia. So you have to choose your research group really based on what you're looking for when when you're in graduate school, because there's obviously the aspect that I love. I don't know if you want me to get into this now and give advice per se to graduate students, but the way I look at it is that you want to love what you're doing and you want to love your project, etc. But as you're growing, you discover so much more that you want to get into a group or a project that offers more than just that one science project, right? You want to experience, I think, almost what the world outside of academia and outside of the studies is like. And I really felt like I was lucky to get into the Love group right away and realize that very fast. And it was I don't know how it is now, but at that time it was very fast paced, right? Like you had to actually submit results every 2 weeks, and I remember Jim would ask, I think, every week to get a report of what you've done.
Yeah.
And I initially thought he would never notice that I never sent mine. And then after a few weeks, he messaged like, oh, by the way, it's been a while. I haven't received your paper or your report. Because there were so many other students, right? I thought I would get away with this. And that's the other part. Like we were, at least in my case, I was supervised, right? Someone was there and looking at what we're doing and guiding us.
Matt Dubin for you?
Matt and Jim, yeah, both of them. Yeah. I think that there are a lot of those aspects you have to take into account. Do you get the right guide? Do you want to be guided, or do you want to have the freedom? Because everybody is very different, right? And the other aspect is like like, how do you want to work? Do you want to work by yourself? Do you want to work as a team? And that is quite beautiful, the teamwork, I think, that we had. Like, everybody was really kind with each other. Everybody was available to help at any time, even though everybody was really busy
Yeah.
with a lot of different things, right, going on, and their project and their studies and their exams and their personal life.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. No,
but
I think I'll respond to that briefly, but I think that um, time gives you better perspective, right? So when I first had joined the group, when I had first joined the group, Jim was still there, and he
okay,
retired, if not in that first year, just after the first year. Um, and I have the the group had really tailed off because the DKIST project was nearly completed, right? So like I said,
gotcha.
Synchrotron, Run, and Alex were the kind of last people, and then Daewoo was taking over the group at that time. Um, and and I remember going in every 2 weeks and kind of presenting to Jim, pretty scared. You know, not that Jim, like Jim's one of my favorite people. I love Jim, but as a young student, you're like, I don't
Yeah,
know. Here's
yeah,
my
yeah.
results, and he would look at and be like, "Oh no, that's not right." You know, okay. Um, and so it felt very stressful. It's like, oh man, this is really hard. Um, but as I look back on it, and I think Daewoo continued the the general experience as much as I was aware of it of Jim's group. Obviously, he made it his own, but it really captured that this expectation of you're gonna get stuff done, and you're gonna get stuff done frequently. Um, you know, I do think it helped, but it didn't feel like it helped at the beginning when
Right.
Daewoo was saying like, well, I had one kid when I whatever, defended his master's thesis, and one kid right for his dissertation, and he was publishing every 3 or 6 months, and it was like, you did that. I don't know that I'll do that, uh, but I think in hindsight, it sets up this environment of, certainly like you said, everybody's working really hard. They're working on hard projects, but there's a lot of camaraderie, and a lot of mutual support. And I think that, just speaking for myself, I think that really served me well, particularly getting into industry, of
Right.
of normalizing this expectation of, yeah, you have to get results,
Mhm.
and they have to be right. Uh, I think that it's something that there's nothing wrong with it, but certainly in other domains or groups of optics, that's the only thing I can really speak on. Oh well, you got results. Any results are good results. Not really, and especially when you get to industry, there's a result you have to get, and you need to figure out how to correctly get that result. And maybe not everyone wants that. So, anyways, I just wanted.
I wouldn't, like, it was very stressful for me too. I can't say um I loved it during the process. Like, I was telling you, it was very stressful. There were parts that were frustrating. Um, and, research, there's always something going wrong, right? And you never know whether you got it or not. And then you have to present with so much confidence that right, that you're sure you worked 100%, that the result you're presenting in front of very smart people, like, you can't fool them either, right? Um, you have it was not easy, for sure. And I'm looking back at it like over 10 years ago, right?
Mhm.
But like you said, over now, 10 plus years later, I think 12 years later, right? Like, oh yeah, it was the best experience. It wasn't the most fun experience, but that's the experience that made me where I am today.
Yeah,
That makes sense. Um, and as a comparison, I think when I was saying everybody was really kind, the difference is when, again, this is a French system, but when we do this prep school that I was talking about at the very beginning, those 2 years where you compete with all of the students of France, basically, um, all different mindset. It depends on which school you are at, but it's not as much project related. So you don't really, you're on your own, right? You're on your own getting the school you want. And if you, right? And there's, again, there's that whole mindset of you don't want to waste time, like whatever time you waste is going to be lost forever. And so that mindset is still there, but at least what I felt, even though I was introduced to this very early on in my education, being in the loved group was as challenging, but with more healthy results in a certain way, in the sense that we were really working together towards a final goal that you could actually see, and that made sense, right? More than I just want to compete with my peer to get to the best score.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was challenging. That's why what I'm saying is that when you choose your group, you have to take all of these aspects into account, right? Like, and very carefully choose that. All these groups are very different. And even whether you're graduate students or later you're a postdoc, or the lab group you go into is very different from one another. And that's something I learned after I came to the US, that the spirit is, it depends what you want to get done. For me, I like to get things done, so it was the best. I feel like it might have been the best place for me because I felt like I was making progress. I was almost forced to make progress much faster than I would want to. But that's how the industry work is, right? Like, and yeah, and if you're prepared for this, if you have the tools to get there, and if that's what you want, again, I'm not saying, far from it, that's where you should do. I'm not saying everybody go to the love group. This is the best group. What I'm saying is that you have to choose a group that's tailored to what your expectations are and what you want to do, and don't choose the group that's easy.
Yeah.
Because you're training for later, right? You're training really for 10, 15 years from now or more, right? And it's a lot of pressure to put on the kids at that age, I guess. But I'm just
Well, and I think that you said at the beginning of our conversation that in I think in high school or somewhere around that time, you weren't totally sure what you wanted to do, but you knew it was related to astronomy, and you knew of optics. Um, I didn't feel that way, and certainly in high school, I don't know, lots of things sound cool. And when I got to college, lots of things sound cool. Um, and even by the time that I got to graduate school, I was fortunate and had options for different programs, but different programs in different fields. And it was, a decision that related certainly to the opportunity. The U of A is a great school. Jim's group was, in my mind, the preeminent group in that domain. So I'm definitely not going to turn it down, but there's other factors to consider. My family was here. That was important to me. So that was probably the most conscious decision I'd made to that point in terms of what I wanted to do. And my decision to go into Jim's group was, I really respect Jim, and big mirrors are really cool and big. Yeah, to put it totally bluntly, it wasn't a sophisticated decision. It was just almost childlike. These are really big mirrors. They're like, wow, this is really cool. But I think that you're absolutely correct it's an important decision, but it's so hard to evaluate. When you're getting into grad school, it's so hard to evaluate, is this the right group? Is this the right research? What do I want to be doing 10 to 15 years down the line?
Mm.
Um, I don't know. I certainly personally don't have a right answer for it, but I think it's worth, at the very least, for anyone going into grad school listening, I think it's worth thinking about. Even if you don't come up with a right answer, at least you can think about it. I don't know if you have anything you want to comment on that.
Oh, you're absolutely right. It's not easy without the experience and the background to make that decision for sure. And also a lot of things is based on luck and whatever experience you've been in. Like, would I have gotten the position with Jim if I didn't do that 2 months internship? I don't know, right? Like it's a lot of things that happen in your life is, I think, by luck and by the circumstances, like your family, like you were saying, right? Your family and your, like where you live, where you grew up, where a lot of things come into account, and you can't like really make a life plan for even now, right? Even now. Um, but I think you can make a short list of 2, 3 things that are very important for you. And those things will change over time. This would won't never ever remain the same, but that would guide you, I think, towards what fits a little better or not, what your expectations are. And it's not easy to make that list. Even if you have to put one bullet point on that list, it's not easy. And it's never easy, really. And that's also why I have RayKi, because I'm like, okay, I want to do everything. I don't want to choose, right? And I think this is fascinating. And but also I have a family that is here, and I want to work in the best case scenario to provide for the family and be present and have that flexibility also, that allows me to have my own business. Is it easy? No, it's not necessarily always easy, but at some point, every single time you have to reassess what are the things you want. And yeah, I'm not sure if that gives really a good advice for those grad students, but it's important to know where we're going with what we have at that time, right? And that doesn't mean it's gonna make your decide for your future for the rest of your life, but at least it gives you like a goal
Yeah.
for a few years in your life, right? And it's just saying it's important to really think about this before. Like in my case, I had, it was I luckily got a scholarship to come to U of A, but if I did not, it's also a big financial burden on my family and being away from them. So whatever decision you end up making really matters, right? It's not like nothing is a small decision, and even if you're just starting off. And I'm sure everybody is in that case, right? But we're already at a stage where our decisions are not insignificant, but yeah, that doesn't mean you're still allowed to make mistakes and you're still allowed to discover. And what we call mistakes are actually, you can use them as different experiences to build up and not repeat the same mistake if it was, right? Like, but I still think, I forget who said that, but someone was saying, like, when you make a decision, you make the decision with the parameters you have at that one time, right? Like, so looking at it later on and say, oh, I should have done this, and that. Yeah, but you have so many other parameters now that you know that you didn't know at that time. So as long as you put thought in what you're doing at that one time and took those parameters, it's okay. Whatever happens, at least you thought about it. with what you could, with what you can, right? And yeah, it is stressful as graduate students, but I also think you need to, I don't know, believe in yourself and what you like, what you don't like, but ask yourself this question because you see, for me, up to the master program, right? I kind of knew more or less I like astronomy, but I had no clue what I wanted to do, right? So my strategy was okay, let me do whatever gives me the most options possible,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? I don't want to decide now. I want to get as many options as possible so that when I know, I can decide.
Mhm.
Um, and I still adopt somehow this strategy, right? I want to do the PhD because after that, there is nothing more
Yeah.
I can do, right? Except maybe doing another PhD. But, do I want to stop at the master's or do I want to stop at the PhD? These are all questions that because I think at the point of the PhD, I already knew that I like science and I like research, but I don't necessarily want to do purely research and science. I I can drive equations and it's fun for a little bit, but do I want to do that for my as a job? I was not 100% sure when I entered before I entered the PhD program, right? But then I was like, well, I'm not sure. I don't know. It's like 50-50, so I might as well just do it.
Yeah.
And then forget about it and see what's next. And I don't regret it. It was fun. Plus, it was in Italy, so there is like worse places to do it.
Um, well, I misled you at the beginning, and I'm probably doing a disservice to you and to the audience, but um, I don't want to take up too much of your time. So we initially had mentioned that we would discuss two of your more recent works, which was work on a high precision Sagnac interferometer and your changes to make that an instantaneous Sagnac interferometer, which I think that work was done at, or at the very least, with Brookhaven.
At Brookhaven, correct, yeah.
And so, if you have time, I'd really love to do another discussion and kind of go through those in more depth. But just to tease the audience a little bit, your work led to an instantaneous polarization-based Sagnac interferometer, which let's see, it achieved a sensitivity of 100 nanoradians, and it looked like the error was generally around, if not dramatically less than 1%, as the tilt got larger than 100 nanoradians. And the other work we are going to discuss, which again, I hope to discuss in a future conversation, was your work on a coded aperture for X-ray fluorescence full field imaging. That's quite a mouthful. It doesn't roll off the tongue. But for this one, it relates to the PSF and to apertures, and your work was involved in creating a Mira array, which again, I apologize, I don't remember what the acronym stands for, but it has very high efficiency because it generally has quite a bit of open area, and it achieves a quote unquote perfect PSF. And the definition of that is that the Mira mask involved with its anti-mask gives you the Dirac delta. And you tested that both with a point source and an extended source in that work. And there was complexity involved in how those made. So I say that just to say I'd really love to have another conversation and dive into that in more detail. I don't want to take too much of your time today. I think that generally, I think it's extremely valuable to hear how you got to where you are, and I just want to re-emphasize for the audience, your compendium of work is insanely impressive. So I think that if you have anything that you would need to do that would fit into Reiki's domain, and how would they find that? I should ask that as well for anyone listening.
I don't have a website yet. I'm still
Okay.
working on it. But they're more than welcome to email me. I
Okay.
think I can send you the email address later, but
Okay.
basically knakoda@RayKiConsulting.com. That's the email address I
Okay.
sent you.
And we
And
include
then
links. We include links in the video and the audio, so we'll definitely include that for anyone listening in the links below. We're missing stuff.
the website is still in progress, but I usually would do an introductory discussion with someone who is interested in a project or discussing certain area of the services, and then we can go on. Usually, we go on from them.
Mm-hmm.
So the best way, would be to just email me and discuss their needs.
Okay, perfect. Now, as promised at the beginning, if you are up for it and have maybe 10 more minutes, I wouldn't mind asking you unrelated to optics questions. Okay, great. Um, so I would say the first question is actually, I'm going to go off script. The first question is, what do Americans not understand and appreciate about French culture?
Oh, interesting. Um, I think one of the it's actually very interesting because my husband is American, so it's a very interesting question. Um, I think they don't. I mean, don't appreciate that we don't complain for the fact of complaining, but we just like to be in the opposition all the time.
What's what's the it's not
But
the phrase, but the action of oh la 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 la. Yeah, yeah.
I,
Yeah, my wife and I visited recently, myself for the first time. She's studying Montpellier um, for part of her university, and I'm sure that if there's anyone listening from France, I can offend many people right now, but I liked the south of France. We're in Aix so much, and Paris. Just for myself, I'm not a city person. It's a beautiful city. The museums were amazing, but the south of France to me, it was just like this is the best place ever. And yeah, so okay, well that's interesting.
yeah, I think that was a big part of when you come mostly in Arizona, because New York is a little different in that sense. But I think people are much more positive. That's what I felt when you come. People are very kind and always everything is really amazing, while the French people are always like grumpy. I mean, I'm obviously exaggerating a little bit, but we usually try to look at the negative, something negative before the positive.
Yeah, yeah,
But again, it's just a cultural aspect. Doesn't mean we are grumpy all the time. It's just to make the conversation more interesting, we would focus on what's wrong rather than what's right.
yeah. Okay, good to know. So the next one is, what surprising job have you had in the past?
Hmm. Yes. Um, yeah, it's not really that surprising, but so I was working with little children, right? So I was doing some outreach with third graders and some preschoolers also. So optics outreach mostly, and I think that was for me, that was very interesting job because the, I mean, it's not as surprising since we are in that field, but having to explain some concept to those kids was very funny because they're so innocent and but they still like think like a researcher, right? Everything is mind blowing to them, and they always ask why and why and why, and you sometimes run out of answers, and all of a sudden you realize this little child just outsmarted you
Yeah.
within 2 minutes, and that is like very very amazing. Um, so I really enjoyed that part, which the other part I enjoyed while doing this is I realized sometimes some of the so that was I was doing that in France, and some kids were a little seen as like disturbing the class too much, or not really listening, or not, and were kind of classified in that area. And then I would come, and I remember that one child who the first two times I entered the classroom was just running everywhere and not listening. It's like a third grade or second grader. And every day I was like, oh my goodness, I'm going to go to that class again and it's going to be a nightmare. But this child, like by himself, decided to do a whole presentation about the sun and like a poster that he put up together, but by himself. And it was so interesting to see how, when feeling engaged, he would be able to actually, like, be so interested. And it's not like a lost case in a certain case, in a certain way, right? Like, it's like, oh, that child, it just needs to be um, entertained and interested, right? And I thought that was, yeah, that was one of the, I don't know if I like teaching per se. I'm interested in trying, but teaching to children is a whole different thing. And it's, it's quite interesting. Yeah, it's a quite interesting experience in that sense.
Yeah, uh, my wife was a math teacher, and so I've had some exposure via that route, and then I've done some tutoring for people I know, um, and it's a really worthwhile experience, I suppose. If anyone listening has ever considered it, it's pretty. There's a lot of kids, particularly in the U.S., who could benefit from tutoring, um, and it's an interesting experience, I think. So
I think it makes you also come out of your world in a certain way and have to adapt to a child's world, which is full of potential, right? Like they usually always have the right question.
yeah,
And this
yeah,
one question you can't answer. And it's very interesting and challenging to see how to respond to that.
yeah. And I'll just, I guess I'll add to that. I helped to tutor a person that I knew who he wasn't going to graduate high school because his grades were too low. And uh, you sit down and you start to go through. I think it shifted a little bit, certainly from when I was in school, but a lot of his work was in like online, like on the computer, so assignments on there. And man, you really don't realize how totally boring school is until you help a kid out with it. It's like, well, you didn't pass
Yeah.
your division stuff. He was really behind. You didn't pass your division or long division. How do you do long division? Okay, well, this is how you do it. And you go through these lessons, and you're like, I hate this. I can't
How
imagine
did
people
I?
doing it all day. Um,
Right.
and you're right. They have the right questions of like, well, why does this matter? Um, but you start to tell them, well, it matters because geometry matters because it deals with optics. And let me tell you, I work with optics, and here's a big mirror. And once you start getting to cool stuff, you grab it.
Absolutely.
Um, anyways,
That's why I was telling you before. We studied optics in school, right? In middle school, high school, but I never made the link, the connection together, right? It was just, again, I studied in France. So I don't want to speak too much about how it is in the US. I'm discovering with my kids growing up, um, but it felt completely disconnected. And I feel like really in education, if you can like put that connection the right way, um, just to raise interest at least. I know it's a lot of work and requires more time, but I think it would help engage more kids.
yeah,
For sure. For
yeah,
sure.
I think that's true. And I also want to be only speaking for myself. I'm not trying to criticize teachers in the US. Um, Dealing with a classroom full of kids is, again, only speaking for myself, a literal nightmare for me. Um, you don't know chaos until you've
Yeah.
tried to do that. Again, I think that if you have the opportunity to do tutoring one on one, one on two, the dynamics shift considerably, and it really frees you up to explore things like you're saying in a way that's more engaging, and maybe outside the confines of you're all sitting here, you're all in the classroom, we have to go through this material. You can start to say, I don't know, you're probably pretty smart. You're probably just really bored sitting here. So let's talk about cool stuff and kind of move through that. Um, so okay, we'll go to the next one, which I think somewhat plays off of this. But what would you be doing if you were not working in science right
Interesting. At some point, I had considered actually child psychiatry. So at some point of time, um, which I found like very, again, for the same reason, actually very fascinating for me, like to try to understand what's really going on through, a child's brain and how they're looking at things and perceiving the environment around them.
now?
So I've never pursued in this. It's just like a interest that I have, but I always found it quite fascinating to understand like a child brains and how flexible it is and how they connect things together, which is how they understand in their own word their environment. So that is one nice thing. The other one was, I think, less, but I really enjoy geopolitics in general. So I wonder if I had done something more related to history and geography and studying. Like, I feel like it would still be some sort of a research position, but where I would have to investigate a little more.
Yeah.
And then a third one, and now that you're asking, I'm thinking I had considered, but it's still science somehow, but what is it considered? The the scientific police, like what is it called? And see, no, yeah, like doing like like police investigation, but in more of a science
Oh, yeah.
way. So obviously that was like when I was younger and fascinated by all these series, this investigative series
Yeah.
on TV. But yeah, I feel like there's always that approach to like researching whatever it is.
You mean like forensics, right? For
Oh yeah, exactly. That's the word I was looking for. Forensic. Correct. But yeah, I feel like all of them are still somehow related to some sort of research and investigation,
yeah.
but just again in different areas.
Hmm. No, that's okay though. I mean, they all sound interesting, and particularly the the geopolitics or when I was a little kid, I mean, oh man, I wanted to be an archaeologist so bad and kind of study history, and I slightly satisfy that reading history books and textbooks today. But okay, well, the last two questions have kept you a very long time. Last two questions. What was the last book that you recommended to a friend?
Very short book. Actually, no, the one book, maybe not the last one, but one of my favorite books, I would say, was uh, Jonathan Livingstone, The Seagull,
Oh, the Sea
by
Johnson.
Richard Bach. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not in my latest reads, but that's one that that I always highly recommend.
Yeah. And again, uh, we'll put that in the show notes. Jonathan Livingston Seagull, I think is what it's called. My
Yeah,
friend,
by Richard Bach, I think.
yeah, my friend gave it to me in my late 20s, and I really loved it. And I think it's almost more of a children's book, but nonetheless, I think anyone can get quite a bit out of it.
I feel like you can read it 5 times and or more and find something a little different each time about it. So I think I had to read it at school when I was in middle school initially. And then a friend of mine gave it to me when I actually came to Arizona. So I read it again. And after that, I read it again. I saw someone reading it in the metro in Paris. And I was like, oh, yeah, I love this book. So I read it again one more time. And every single time, I felt like the outcome of the book were very different, and which makes it a masterpiece, in my opinion, right? Like, if you can read or rewatch a movie or a book over and over again and have something different that yeah, that it have a different message that you get from it each time is very fascinating.
Yeah, I like that definition a lot. I like to I like to watch movies and rate them, and I always try to keep it a short rating scale. But one of my requirements for it to be a quote unquote, like a great movie is that I keep thinking about it. But I really like that addition that each time you watch it or read it, you get something else out of it. So, um, okay, well, the last question, what is the last book that you put down before finishing?
The last book I put down before finishing it.
Yeah, that you were reading it and said this is not worth finishing.
Oh, not worth finishing. I usually don't. It's hard for me to not finish. Even if I feel like it's a complete waste of time, I still finish it. But I would say one that I feel like I wasted my time finishing it anyways was a book called The Housemaid. And I forget who the author is, to be honest. Um, it's a bit of a psychological thriller, which I usually enjoy, but I thought it was very teenager-esque. It was not. But I still finished it. But I I would maybe not
You wish you hadn't.
recommend.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's hard for me not to finish something. It's like if I start something, I have to finish it, whatever it takes. It's kind of my mindset. But yeah, but I'm reading another book right now. Speaking of books, that's called Anxious People.
Hmm.
And it's very interesting. I haven't finished it yet, but it's it's a story of like how do you say it? A bank that turns into a hostage situation, and each character is a little. It feels like each character is more special than the person who's actually
Doing the robbery.
doing the hostage. Yeah, so each hostage has different. You go through the investigation with trying to find where the robber is. And by doing that, you have to interview all the different hostages that were free. But as it goes through, you discover they're all a little bit um, on the edge. It's very, very interesting with like the personality characteristics and how the book plays along. But I haven't finished it yet. So up to chapter 30, I would recommend it.
Yeah. I might have to look that up. Most of the books I've read are either have either been nonfiction, which I've been enjoying, or fiction, but of the lowest denominator. Like you said, teenager books. I
Okay.
tend to go back to some of the science fiction or fantasy novels I read when I was younger, just because they're easy and comfortable to read sometimes. So I haven't had a book with really good characters or character development
Yeah.
in a while. So um, okay, well, I've taken way more of your time than I said I would.
Sorry.
Um, this was really enjoyable.
It was a pleasure to thank you. Thank you very much, Logan. Yeah.